There's an interesting extension to this idea of working memory that most people really don't even consider, and that's daydreaming, or what they call stimulus independent thoughts. I think that's kind of a funny term. But neither the phonological loop nor the visuospatial sketchpad is responsible for those daydreams. And producing those appears to involve the central executive. Basically, we have to conjure these things independently, arguably as a product mostly of our imagination or determination and frontal lobe areas, but they're easier. One take-home message about working memory that's in those last paragraphs on 121 and 122, in which there's considerable detail about that. But the bottom line is that they're easier during practice tasks. And those tasks taxing the central executive can rescue us from SITs and worrying. So basically, if I'm preoccupied with thoughts, and let me correct that little typo there, it might be the case that I can liberate myself from those catastrophic daydreams that we sometimes have where we're conjuring worst case outcomes. In that case, I can rescue myself from those by doing something that really overtaxes my central executive and makes me concentrate quite a bit. On the other hand, if there are times in which I'm not being taxed at all, I'm freer to daydream, and that could go in a positive or negative direction. So, for instance, as I'm driving, just last Thursday, I had the opportunity to go do something fun in Houston. It's an easy drive. You can hardly get lost. And the place we were going happened to be right off 59, so really no trouble at all. But of course, during the whole trip, my mind just sailed. I can listen to the radio and conjure what I'm going to do the next day, and the conversations I'm going to have, and the bills I need to pay, and other whimsical things about music or what have you. And all of those things are easy because I've now been driving nearly 40 years. I've got 40 years practice at driving, and it's easy for me to do that because it doesn't tax me in the least. On the other hand, if I were to be occupied with something that was rather substantial and involved a lot of concentration, like grading a statistics test, which takes a long time by hand, in that case, I would be less inclined to daydream and less inclined to conjure and weigh catastrophic thoughts, etc. So basically, producing these daydreams taxes the central executive, and that can be blocked with things that are involved and complicated. And you can imagine that. Imagine the first driving test that you took, and how involved that was. I remember, and this is almost 40 years ago, I learned to drive on an 8-cylinder car that was rather unwieldy. So I was scared to death of merging and turn signals and parallel parking, and I've never in my life daydreamt less than I did at that moment. I was overwhelmed with what was happening with this elderly driving instructor driving a very powerful car. And in that case, being overtaxed liberated me from the worries I had about other things. So it's kind of a basic idea, but I think you can relate to it. Another thing is I love speaking of this idea of working memory because it appears in indirect and sometimes direct ways on intelligence tests. So people with higher working memory capacity, so they have a larger span. So what I mean by capacity, remember people that could remember the last word of a handful of sentences in a row. If they could remember a lot of sentences in a row, their last words, then in that case we might consider them to have a higher span. Or they could remember 10 digits in a row and repeat them backwards. They would have a higher span. But people with higher working memory capacities, they're less susceptible to inattentional blindness, as we refer to in the attention chapter, less susceptible to having their attention drawn to a misleading cue in an attention task. And there's one that's described at the very last pages of 122, the last paragraphs, that's really, really direct, but something could jump up and attempt to grab their attention away in a very basic attention task, and they're very, very good at suppressing that and not being drawn to it. They're better at reasoning and decision-making, less likely to be misled by leading questions in an eyewitness task, and are just better able to control their cognitive focus. So this would be somewhat akin to what they call fluid intelligence. Basically, the idea is you have this adaptive power that you bring to anything. And it may be a novel task. It may be a new situation. You could be testifying in court. You could be giving an address to a new audience. And these higher working memory capacities come to your aid in that context. Now, there's another sort of intelligence that's not particularly related to working memory that's crystallized. The knowledge that you're presumed to have accrued at fairly early ages or advanced ages. So if I were asking 10-year-olds about math, I want to tap their crystallized knowledge. I'd say, well, you just bought an item for $1. The sales tax is 10%. What's the whole bill? Of course, it'd be $1.10. And I might assume that they could know that in the 5th grade. I might assume that they could know what the radius of a circle means versus the circumference versus the diameter, things like that, accrued knowledge. And as a 54-year-old, I would like to think that my accrued knowledge could be tested also as any age adult. So for instance, can you name a country in the Middle East? In which hemisphere is Australia? What's the boiling point of water? You would think that a person of reasonable intelligence would have accrued that knowledge at some point, and that's crystallized. But the other sort of intelligence is fluid. It applies to brand new tasks, and it is thought to be a byproduct of working memory.